And now we're going to look at passive transport. What is passive transport? What are some examples of passive transport, and why are they important? So the most important thing when we look at some kind of passive transport, it is basically it's diffusion. What is diffusion? It is a movement of some substance from high concentration to low concentration. So that's the first basic principle of some kind of passive transport. The second most important thing, it requires no ATP. Diffusion basically is the movement of some kind of substrate down a concentration gradient. So it goes with the substrates. So it does not require any ATP. Okay? So now let's talk about a couple examples of this type of passive transport. So we said passive transport, high concentration or low concentration. What was that? That was diffusion. So one type of passive transport is simple diffusion. So what is simple diffusion? It is the transfer of certain molecules from a high concentration to a low concentration. So what does that mean? So what are some examples? Gases, right? So when we look at the specific cell, right? So you have the cell membrane. What can bypass these cells, right? So the cell needs oxygen, right? So it needs oxygen to do the process of cellular respiration and generate ATP. How does it happen? So a lot of gases use simple diffusion where they go from a high concentration to a low concentration. An example of this, right? So when we look at the actual cell, when the cell membrane is a semi-permeable membrane, so special types of molecules are permissive, right? So one example is water. So the diffusion of water now, or water going from a high concentration to a low concentration, is called osmosis. Okay, so osmosis. So these semi-permeable membranes allow for a selective group of molecules to bypass, and one of them is water. And the simple diffusion of water is called osmosis. Now, when we look at the cell contains this structure called the cell membrane, and the cell membrane is made of what? What is it made of? So it's semi-permeable, so it's only permeable to water, but it doesn't allow any other metabolites. There's certain other metabolites that have a problem getting in. So first thing is you have to look at the structure of the cell membrane. What is it made of? Cell membrane is made of phospholipids. So what is that? That's a lipid. Is that a polar or non-polar? It is non-polar. When we look at the charges, for example, the salts, the sugars, the proteins, these are polar or non-polar. So salts, sugars, and proteins are polar molecules. So they have a problem actually entering the cell. They can't, right? They differ in physical property. So the body has developed these specific type of protein channels, or channel proteins, that allow for this process to take place. This is the other form of passive transport. Okay? So it's called facilitated diffusion. So what does that mean? What does facilitate mean? It means to help, and it's a form of diffusion, going from a high concentration to a low concentration. So how does this work? Well, basically you have these little carrier proteins. So if I were to draw it, so if you look at a cell, for example, and we can do a whole lecture on these special type of carrier proteins that are on the cell membrane that allow the passage of certain substrates. So majority of them are the polar substrates that are unable to bypass. Okay? So this is an example of facilitated diffusion. So for example, the glucose transporters, or the potassium leak channels, or the sodium leak channels. These are examples of facilitative diffusion, is basically allowing for different concentrations of molecules to go in and out of the cell that differ in the physical properties from the cell membrane. And the final thing is filtration. Filtration is the movement of solutes and solvents, right? So water and, for example, salts, going from a high concentration to a low concentration without the requirement of any kind of energy. So where does this happen? Usually, like for example, if you look at your blood vessels and your capillary beds, the hydrostatic pressure that's generated from the heart pushes certain ions and certain fluids in and out of the bloodstream, whether they enter the capillary beds, the interstitial fluids, whichever one, it doesn't really matter. That's an example of filtration. So these four are examples, these terms, of passive transport.